Welcome to Collecting Elton. In this episode, I continue ranking my favorite Elton albums, this time numbers 21 to 31, the group I call the very likable to pretty good albums. It's all a matter of opinion, of course, my opinion, but I'm bound to anger someone. Happens every time. Stay tuned. If you've seen the first two ranking videos, you'll know how this works. But rather than count backwards, this time I'll begin with my number 21 and work my way down, as it were, to number 31. And I'll try to move through these a bit more quickly than usual. I have 11 albums to cover this time instead of the usual 10. And please try to remember, this is not meant as an objective list. I've based these rankings entirely on my own tastes and preferences, and the personal relationships I've formed with these albums over the years, in most cases over decades. So I expect that other people's lists will be different from mine. So let's begin with my number 21, Rock of the Westies, released in October 1975. It was produced by Gus Dudgeon, performed with Elton's newly formed Westies band, and recorded at the Caribou Ranch Studios in Colorado. Westies was the third of what I call Elton's Caribou trilogy. As a kid, I'd always found Westies weak, almost anemic sounding, and the songwriting weaker than on other Elton albums of the same period. So it used to rank much, much lower on my list than it does now. Then, as I've explained a few times already on this channel, I obtained a copy of Kevin Gray's audiophile mastering of the album, released as an Audio Fidelity Gold CD in 2012. Gray's mastering added warmth to the album's overall sound and much-needed heft to the album's lower end. And that copy substantially changed my opinion of the album. It helped me appreciate many of the album's songs and better appreciate the album as a musical performance. As strong as many of its tracks are individually, this is one of those albums that plays much better as a single continuous experience. That said, my favorite songs include Grow Some Funk of Your Own, Street Kids, Hard Luck Story, and Feed Me. And this copy, right here, is one of the original DJM copies pressed by Pi Records in 1975, with lacquers cut by Aaron Chakraverty. It's a great vinyl copy to have. Next is number 22. Released in May 1980, 21 at 33 was Elton's first album of the 80s, but also the last full album Elton would co-produce with longtime engineer Clive Franks. It includes the hit Little Genie, co-written with Gary Osborne, and the fan favorite Two Rooms at the End of the World, co-written with Bernie to celebrate their reunion as a writing team. Strong tracks like Chasing the Crown, Sartorial Eloquence, Two Rooms at the End of the World, and White Lady White Powder make this album worthwhile for me, but syrupy, dated songs like Dear God, Never Gonna Fall in Love Again, and the Judy Zook collaboration Gimme the Love suggest that while Elton recorded some stunning tracks for the album, for some reason he didn't want to include all the best of them on the album. Most of them became B-sides. And at only 9 tracks, the album's always felt unfinished to me. It's difficult sometimes for me to play this album and appreciate what it had included. Perhaps I'm too often reminded of what it had excluded. But again, it's still a very likable album overall. This copy is a rare 1980 Yugoslavian copy on Blue Label Philips. And its side 2 is well known among collectors for its alternate track listing. And for more details about that, see my showcase short about the Other Sides LP of 1982. Next is number 23, Regimental Sergeant Zippo, produced by Caleb Quay, recorded in 1967-68, but not released until June 2021. I love this album, which, in case you're not familiar with its story, was Elton's first attempt at a full-length album. Zippo doesn't rank as high on my list as perhaps it should, but that's only because I've known it as an album for just 3 years now, and after many, many more years of playing its songs from various bootlegs, I still feel more familiar with the bootlegs than I do with this official release. But overall, I do think it's a thrilling collection of songs. My favorites include Angel Tree, Tartan Colored Lady, A Dandelion Dies in the Wind, and my favorite of all the songs Elton recorded during this era, indeed it's probably my favorite John Taupin song pre-Skyline Pigeon, and that's Watching the Planes Go By. Elton and Bernie were still inexperienced songwriters at this point, still far from reaching the heights they'd later achieve. But I think that with Zippo, they began to fulfill their promise as aspiring songwriters, and Elton his promise as a recording artist. Now, this copy is one of the many records given to me by my friend Michael, and it's a Record Store Day 2021 mono copy, still sealed with the hype sticker. My own copy is unsealed, so I've decided to leave this one sealed. Kind of different for me. Next, number 24. Released in June 1992 and produced by Chris Thomas, The One was Elton's first full studio album of what I call his new man period. He'd completed rehab, embraced middle age, and had finally solved his hair loss problem with an elaborate and expensive hair weave. No better time to release a new album. But I didn't like The One so much at first. Simple Life I thought was too long, and I hated the harmonica. Sweat It Out I thought was fantastic, but it didn't know when to end. I used to skip Runaway Train because back then I didn't like the sound of Eric Clapton's voice, and although Understanding Women seemed appealingly atmospheric, it too went on too long. In fact, too long seems to be one of the album's two biggest issues. The other issue is that the album seems disjointed. On their own, the songs range from good to excellent, but the album doesn't have the broader personality that albums like Sleeping with the Past and Made in England have. That said, The North is still one of my favorite John Taupin songs of all time. I still love Emily, which was my favorite album track when I was a kid. I've grown to love the single remix of Simple Life. It's shorter, and the harmonica isn't as abrasive. And now that I'm a big Clapton fan, Runaway Train has become one of my favorite Elton John songs of the 90s. Now, this copy is an original UK Rocket copy from 1992, cut by Tim Young, and plated at DFI France, although I'm not entirely sure where it was pressed. I used to think it was pressed at EMI Hayes in the UK, but I don't think so now. And anyway, like all original vinyl copies of the album from 1992, this was a single LP, not a double LP like the 2022 reissue was. Next, number 25, and one I'm sure that many Classic Years fans have been waiting for. And that's Caribou, released in June 1974, produced by Gus Dudgeon and recorded at Caribou Ranch Studios. I think that Caribou is a very good album. I love Pinky, Solar Prestige Gammon, I've Seen the Saucers, and Don't Let the Sun Go Down on Me. But, as strange as this might sound to others, I can live without the rest. The Bitch Is Back, in a way, has always reminded me of Yakety Yak by the Coasters, which I've never liked. Other songs in the album have always seemed kind of cornball to me, songs like Dixie Lily and Stinker. I do agree that Ticking is a kind of masterpiece. It's just been a long time since I've sat through the whole thing. I don't like horns, so the Tower of Power's contributions to the album have never thrilled me very much. The other thing is the sleeve. It's awful. One of the worst sleeves in Elton's catalog. It just radiates tackiness. Now, it's true, I was thrilled with this year's Record Store Day Deluxe Anniversary Edition of Caribou, but my enthusiasm was more for the bonus material. Maybe what I need is to sit down with the original album again and attempt to reconnect with it. Anyway, this copy is a UK DJM copy. Specifically, it's the 1981 reissue, which was possibly the last UK reissue of Caribou before Polygram took over the DJM label in 1986. Alright, number 26. Released in April 1971 and produced for LP by Gus Dudgeon, the original 171170 was Elton's first official live album. It presents selections from a radio performance Elton did in New York on November 17, 1970. A small audience watched while the Elton John trio, Elton, Nigel and Dee, pretty much reprised their now legendary Troubadour program from just 3 months earlier. Over the last 50 years, this album's gained a reputation as one of rock's greatest live albums, so you might wonder why it doesn't rank higher on my list. Well, while I agree that the 171170 performance was and remains a hell of a performance, my issues are more with the many attempts made over the last 50 years to turn that performance into a live album. To begin, the original 6-track LP of 1971 had been rushed to release, a slapdash solution to the ever-growing bootleg problem. But that official version comprised not even half the original show, and for reasons still unclear to me, originally appeared in 2 very different mixes. the Uni Records or American mix by Dave Henschel versus the DJM or International mix by Clive Franks. As a fan, it's nice to have two vintage mixes to choose from, but which one is the true 171170? Or is the album's name 111770? Are we talking about one or two different albums here? I'm not sure even Gus Dudgeon knew, for in 1995, to prepare 171170 for Elton's Classic Years Remastered CDs, Dudgeon remixed and resequenced the album anew, thereby creating a third version. As many as 4 different sounding official versions of the album now exist, the latest and most complete being 171170 Plus, a Record Store Day 2017 exclusive, which featured the original album in its 1971 American mix, plus the rest of the show, previously unreleased, on a second LP remixed by Matt Still. But as an archival release, 171170 Plus doesn't qualify for ranking on my list. I've based my opinion here on the album's original 1971 versions, which to me have always seemed too brief and incomplete. Anyway, this copy is an original 1971 Uni Records copy with the American title, and which uses the original American mix. It's a Canadian copy, specifically pressed at MCA Cornwall, using stampers from Gloversville. Now, technically, there's nothing special about this copy, but I chose it for sentimental reasons. This very copy was among the 4 second-hand Elton LPs I bought when I was just 13, that day I took my first trip shopping for used vinyl, and I still have it. Number 27, an album I used to really dislike, but in recent years it's become a rising star on my list. Ice on Fire, released in November 1985, produced by Gus Dudgeon and recorded in England. You could say Ice had many strikes against it from the beginning. For example, having reunited his Classic Years band in 1982, for Ice on Fire, Elton decided, for the second time in 11 years, to dismiss Dee Murray and Nigel Olsson, changing the sound of his band once again, and in many listeners' opinions, not for the better. And rather than work again with Chris Thomas, who'd produced 3.5 of Elton's Royal Flush albums of the early 1980s, for Ice on Fire, Elton reunited with producer Gus Dudgeon, who I'm sure was grateful to work with Elton again, but who it seems did not want to recapture the Elton John of the early to mid-1970s. Instead, Dudgeon plunged Elton deep into the waters of contemporary synth-heavy pop, creating a glassy-sounding product, thick on production but thin on songwriting. At least that's what I used to think. But in the 34 years since my first copy, I've grown to like Ice on Fire, and I now appreciate more what Elton and Gus were reaching for, even if it still seems like they missed some kind of mark somewhere. It is the album that spawned the massive smash Nikita, plus minor hit Wrap Her Up, both featuring a Wham-era George Michael on backup. Other album favorites of mine include This Town, Soul Glove, Tell Me What the Papers Say, and Satellite. This copy is my original 1985 Japanese Rocket copy, still with its obi, which, like many Japanese first pressings of Elton John albums from the 1980s, was pressed at Phonogram Tokyo on JVC Super Vinyl. Number 28. Recorded in Atlanta and produced by Elton himself, Peachtree Road was released in 2004. Some fans have described Peachtree as Elton's tumbleweed of the 2000s, and I think that's a fair comparison in some ways. Peachtree adopts the country rock style Elton had rediscovered on 2001's Songs from the West Coast, but Peachtree seemed even less concerned with commercial appeal than West Coast had. Some fans consider that one of Peachtree's strengths, but I think a bit more commercial appeal might have improved the album. My initial impressions of it weren't positive. It wasn't until years later, after moving to the American South, that I appreciated just how well Peachtree Road captures Southern culture and a sense of the Southern landscape. So I eventually grew to respect and enjoy many of the album's songs. My only remaining issue with Peachtree, just one, but it's a biggie, is that I think Elton could have picked better songs and sequenced the final album very differently. As it is, the album's first half plays well and keeps my attention. But the second half, despite having all that I'm allowed, which I love, it just slumps into snoozeville. Meanwhile, first-rate songs like How's Tomorrow, Keep It a Mystery, and Peter's Song, 3 of my most favorite Elton songs of the last 25 years, were excluded, released only as B-sides. Now this copy is my only vinyl copy of the album. This is the Mercury reissue from a few years ago, pressed by Optimal in Germany. And like the original UK double vinyl issue from 2005, it uses an alternate and I think much better sleeve design, and also reserves its fourth side for several bonus tracks. But don't get too excited. Those bonus tracks weren't the session outtake B-sides that I and other fans love so much. They were songs from Billy Elliot. Oh well, I still like this copy. Number 29. Empty Sky, officially Elton's first album, which was produced by Steve Brown and released in the UK in June 1969. I haven't too much to say about this album. It's a first album, and of course now that Zippo is officially available, comparing one to the other is unavoidable. I love songs like Valhalla, Western Ford Gateway, Lady What's Tomorrow, and Skyline Pigeon, but I'd say that in some ways Empty Sky was more of a step backwards for Elton than a step forwards, despite the quality of many of its songs. While making Zippo, Elton and Bernie, and Caleb too possibly, were never entirely sure that the album would get a proper release. But with Empty Sky, which Dick James had planned as his newly formed label's first proper release, for Elton and Bernie, the whole point was to make a debut album, and I sometimes wonder if that affected Elton's approach. Both in writing style and production style, Regimental Sergeant Zippo shows a confidence I've never detected on Empty Sky. But it was a first album, and you gotta start somewhere. This copy is my original 1969 UK DJM stereo copy, which was cut by Howard Barrow at Pi's Mastering Studios in London. I prefer the album's original mono mix, but I haven't found a vinyl copy of that. Not yet. Alright, the next album has what I've long considered my #1 favorite album cover of all time by any artist. And yet, on this list, the album itself ranks number 30. And that album is A Single Man, released in October 1978, co-produced by Elton John and Clive Franks, and recorded in England. Single Man was Elton's first album of new material since 1976's Blue Moves, and is most notable as his first album without Taupin, a departure that perhaps inspired the album's title. A Single Man had come about when Elton finished recording his early 1978 non-LP single Ego, but kept writing melodies without lyrics. Gary Osborne, Elton's friend and a professional songwriter, was asked to write lyrics for those melodies, a process very different from what Elton had been used to. The result was the Single Man album. Although Elton and Gary Osborne would continue writing together sporadically until the mid-1980s, A Single Man remains the only album they wrote together exclusively. The results weren't terrible. Songs like Shine On Through, Return to Paradise, Part-Time Love, and Georgia are among my favorite John Osborne songs. But the results sounded much softer overall than Elton's previous albums, the songs almost like musical greeting cards. Commercial can sound good, but it can also sound bad. Some tracks, Big Dipper and Shooting Star for example, are among my least favorite songs in the Elton John catalog. But the gem of the album is really its playout track, the beautiful Song for Guy, a mesmerizing instrumental which became a hit in the UK. But A Single Man is a lightweight record overall. It's hard sometimes to believe that Elton had abandoned his sessions the previous October with Philly soul producer Tom Bell, only to record and release Single Man instead. At one point, in January 1979, Bell even expressed resentment to a music reporter that nothing of his work with Elton had yet been released. Well, if Bell ever heard the Single Man album, I can't imagine it made him feel any better. Okay, now this copy here is a highly collectible copy, one about which I'm currently preparing a showcase short to air before the end of the year. It's a very limited MCA Canada copy from 1979, pressed on translucent yellow vinyl. And if you think that yellow was an odd choice of vinyl for this album, well, I agree. But believe me, that's this version's least mystifying aspect. And the last entry for this list, number 31, The Union, Elton's collaboration with Leon Russell, produced by T-Bone Burnett and released on Decca Records in 2010. I really adore certain songs on this album. If It Wasn't for Bad, Jimmy Rogers' Dream, Gone to Shiloh, and Mandalay Again, the last of which was available only on the album's deluxe version. But the rest of the album is just too boring for me. Believe me, I've tried. I think Elton and Leon's voices blended well, and it's great to have two fantastic piano players on the same album. And I like Leon Russell a lot. I got to see him live about 10 years ago. But other than those 4 songs, which again I really love and adore, I just can't connect with the album. Anyway, this is my original US double vinyl copy, which I bought brand new about 12 years ago. It was cut by Ron McMaster at Capitol Mastering in Los Angeles and pressed by United Pressing in Nashville. It's not a bad copy. So that's it. I have only one more ranking video to complete. My numbers 32 to 41, my least favorite Elton albums. I think I'll name the video Even God Makes Mistakes or something like that. Look for it in coming weeks. In the meantime, thanks for watching as always. Please click like and consider subscribing to my channel if you haven't already. A big thank you to those who've already subscribed. I'm finally past 500 subs now. I thank you so much for your ongoing support. There's lots more fun ahead.